Hey folks, tonight we're going back to a time when winter wasn't just a season, it was a survival test. We'll be unraveling the strange, clever, and sometimes just plain desperate ways medieval peasants kept themselves alive through nights so cold your breath might have frozen mid-sentence. But first, if you enjoy winding down with weird, wonderful slices of history, you know the drill. Feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if this is your kind of bedtime story. No pressure. Also, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always love seeing our little sleep-deprived community spread across the world. Now, dim the lights, pull up your blanket, and let's begin. Because somehow, against all odds and all logic, medieval peasants didn't just freeze to death every winter. And frankly, how they pulled that off still feels like a mystery. Imagine a winter so cold, your breath hangs in the air like a ghost that forgot to leave. Now imagine that same winter settling into your bones, with no heater, no blankets from the store, and no thermostat to argue over. That was the reality for medieval peasants. They didn't prepare for winter. They braced for it. There was no escaping it. No vacation homes in warmer places. No packing up and heading south for the season. The village was your whole world, and once the snows came, the world shrunk even more. Roads vanished beneath layers of white, forest paths turned into traps, and the fields where you once worked became a flat sheet of ice and frost. You stayed put, you survived, or you didn't. The cold wasn't just outside. It was inside your home, in your hands, in your breath, in your sleep. The small mud house you shared with your family didn't do much to keep it out. The walls were made of wattle and daub, a kind of medieval DIY project involving sticks, mud, and sheer optimism. The roof was straw, and if you were lucky, it didn't leak. But it almost always leaked. Some houses had gaps so big, the wind made itself right at home. It didn't ask for permission. It slipped under the door, through the cracks in the wall, even down the chimney. Every room had a draft, and every draft had a name. There was the one that whistled through the floorboards, the one that poked you in the back when you sat near the fire, and the one that rattled the shutters like an impatient spirit. Nighttime was the worst. The fire would die down, the temperature would drop, and suddenly you were lying in the dark, curled up beside your siblings, wrapped in whatever rags or straw you could find, wondering if you'd still be able to feel your toes by morning. The cold didn't just numb, it whispered. It pressed in on you like a second skin. There were no glass windows, just holes stuffed with cloth or animal skins. No insulation, just a hope that the wind would get bored and go bother someone else. When it snowed, it piled up against the outside of the house. Sometimes that helped a little, sealing the cold in rather than letting more in. But it also meant you could wake up to find your door frozen shut. The idea of privacy didn't exist in the way we think of it. When you slept, you didn't get a room to yourself. You didn't even get a corner. Everyone piled in together. Parents, children, maybe even the neighbor's kid who had lost his family last winter. It was messy and crowded, but warmth was a group effort. It had to be. You couldn't just get up and make a cup of tea when you felt chilled. You couldn't even count on water not being frozen in the bucket. If you wanted warm food, you had to relight the fire, and if the embers had died out, that meant striking flint and hoping the kindling wasn't damp. Some nights, you just ate cold bread and slept with an onion under your arm. Not for any medical reason. It was just something people tried. The worst part wasn't even the temperature. It was the uncertainty. No one knew how long the freeze would last. Days, weeks, months. If the harvest had been poor, you went into winter knowing the food would run out. If the roof was weak, you went into winter hoping it would hold through one more storm. If someone fell ill, there was nowhere to go. No doctors, no medicine, Just whatever herbs your grandmother remembered, and a lot of guessing. People didn't complain about the cold the way we do now. There were no weather apps, no forecasts, no feels-like temperatures. It just got cold, and then it got colder, and then you waited to see who would make it to spring. And if you did make it, you didn't celebrate. You just went back to work. But through all of that, the mystery remains. How did they do it? How did people, year after year, without modern materials or electricity or central heating, manage to stay alive? How did they not freeze to death in their sleep, in a house that barely qualified as a shelter? Some of the answers are practical. Fire, layering, body heat. But some of it feels like something deeper, a kind of stubbornness, a refusal to give in. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was community. Maybe it was just that they didn't have a choice. Whatever the reason, they survived. Not all of them, not every year, but enough. Enough to keep going, enough to raise families, enough to tell stories, enough to pass on the lessons, the tricks, the whispered warnings. And now, centuries later, we get to sit in our warm beds with blankets and soft pillows and wonder how they did it. We try to imagine a night without heat, without silence, without comfort, and the truth is, we can't fully know. That kind of cold, the kind that curls around your bones and watches you sleep, is something most of us will never meet. But they did, and somehow they made it through. Let's talk about clothes. Not the fancy brocade robes of nobles or the velvet sleeves of court musicians. No jewels, no lace, no fur-lined collars, just layers. Plain, scratchy, unwashed layers stacked on top of each other like a pile of blankets that walked and occasionally sneezed. For medieval peasants, layering wasn't a style choice. It was survival. Every piece of fabric you owned became part of your armor against the cold. It didn't matter if it matched. It didn't matter if it fit. All that mattered was whether it kept the chill from crawling under your skin. Start with a shirt, usually linen if you had one. Not crisp white linen, freshly laundered and pressed. This was more like soft beige, slowly turning grey, with small repairs stitched in by tired fingers. Over that, a tunic, or maybe two, one for warmth, the other to protect the first from wear. If your tunic had holes, you patched them. If it didn't, you were lucky. Then came the outer layers. A thick wool cloak, if you could afford one, or a second tunic made of coarser fabric. Sleeves were important. You didn't want gaps at the wrists. Cold crept in that way. Belts were useful too, not just for holding tools, but for keeping layers snug to the body, trapping any warmth you managed to generate. Pants weren't like modern trousers. They were more like long shorts with separate leg wrappings. You tied strips of wool or linen around your calves, like makeshift thermal insulation. It wasn't elegant, but it worked. Bare ankles were an invitation to frostbite. And socks? Not really. You wrapped your feet in cloth, if you had extra, and hoped for the best. Boots were rare. Wooden clogs, maybe. Or leather shoes passed down from older siblings until they barely held together. Some people stuffed straw into the toes for insulation. Others lined them with rags or old wool. Wet feet were a disaster. If your shoes let in snow, the cold got in fast, and it stayed. The smell was not pleasant. Washing clothes in winter was almost impossible. Streams froze, water had to be heated on the hearth, and that heat was too valuable to waste. So you didn't wash unless absolutely necessary. Instead, you layered. You added new shirts over old ones. You wore the same trousers for weeks, maybe months. If you took off your layers, you risked freezing, so you kept them on. Even when they itched, even when they smelled, even when they started to feel more like a second skin than clothing. Some peasants rubbed animal fat onto exposed skin to seal in warmth. It didn't smell great, but it helped. Others wrapped rags around their fingers and ears. Scarves weren't really a thing, but old cloth or wool could be tied around the neck, tucked into a collar, pulled up over the mouth to warm your breath. Children had it the worst. They grew quickly, and clothes didn't always keep up. A child in a tunic 3 sizes too small, with sleeves ending above the elbows, was a common sight. Parents did what they could. They cut down old garments, stitched together scraps, tied fabric around waists and legs. Kids didn't complain. They shivered. They got used to it. People didn't talk about layering in terms of fashion. They talked about it in terms of layers survived. This tunic was from the famine year. That cloak was stitched during the frost of '86. Each piece told a story, and each story ended with someone still breathing. Inside the home, you didn't strip down to get comfortable. You kept most of your layers on, even when sleeping. Taking off your clothes meant exposing your skin to air so cold it felt like a slap. Changing was done quickly, near the fire, and only when absolutely necessary. The layering didn't just trap heat. It trapped identity. You could tell who someone was by their clothes, not because they were stylish, but because they were lived in. You knew who had lost someone by the patchy cloak. You knew who was struggling by the frayed sleeves and thinning wool. Clothes carried the quiet weight of every winter before. Sometimes, people wore layers into spring, not because it was still freezing, but because they were afraid. Afraid the cold might come back, suddenly, like it always did. Afraid of being caught off guard. Afraid that this time, they wouldn't be ready. We talk about fashion now as something expressive. Back then, layering wasn't self-expression. It was resistance. A way to say, quietly, I'm still here. I'm still warm enough to work. Warm enough to wake. Warm enough to survive another day. And somehow, wrapped in threadbare tunics, stiff boots, and wool that scratched like straw, they did. One layer at a time. If you were to pick one object that stood between life and death during a medieval winter, it wouldn't be a sword or a shield or even a roof. It would be fire. More specifically, the hearth. A crackling, smoky, unpredictable little miracle tucked into the center of a cold, drafty home. The hearth was not just where you cooked your food. It was not just where you dried your socks or warmed your fingers. It was everything. A heat source, a light source, a gathering place, a line of defense. Without it, the cold had no barrier. The moment the fire died, the darkness rushed in, and with it came the risk of frostbite, illness, and everything worse. Starting a fire wasn't easy. You couldn't press a button or strike a match. You needed flint and steel, dry kindling, patience, and preferably some experience. If your kindling was damp, forget it. If your flint was dull, forget it. If the wind got into your house while you were trying to spark a flame, forget it again. This is why peasants didn't let their fires go out. Not if they could help it. Once you got one burning, you protected it like it was a child. You banked the fire, piling ash over the embers to smother the oxygen and slow the burn. If you did it right, you'd wake up to a faint glow, just enough to coax the flame back to life. If you did it wrong, you woke up cold, very cold. Firekeeping was a serious job. In many homes, someone took the night shift, getting up at intervals to check the coals, add fuel, adjust the air. This wasn't glamorous work. It was half asleep fumbling in the dark, trying not to trip over a sleeping goat or step on your brother. It was smoky eyes and burnt fingers, but it was necessary. Wood was precious. You didn't waste it. You didn't throw on a log unless you absolutely had to. Most of the time, you used sticks, twigs, straw, or dried dung. Yes, dung. Not the most fragrant fuel, but effective. You used what you had. If your family could spare a few logs for the winter, they were stacked carefully in the driest corner of the home and only used on the coldest nights. When firewood ran low, people burned anything that would catch. Old baskets, broken stools, even parts of the house if things got bad enough. A missing beam might mean a colder spring, but it was better than freezing in the middle of February. The hearth was central, not just physically, but emotionally. It was where people gathered in the evenings. Children listened to stories. Elders warmed their bones. Neighbors might stop by to share gossip or trade food. The fire was the closest thing peasants had to a television, a comfort, a companion. They didn't stare into it idly. They stared into it because there wasn't much else to do after sunset, and because it reminded them they were still alive. In some places, people carried fire from one home to another, in the form of smouldering embers nestled inside clay pots. If your fire died, and you couldn't relight it, you went to the neighbor's house and begged for a coal, not as a favor, as a necessity. Everyone knew the cold showed no mercy. Helping someone relight their hearth could mean the difference between life and death. Firekeeping came with rituals. Some families spoke to the fire like it was a living thing. They thanked it. They pleaded with it. They fed it carefully. They believed, on some level, that the hearth responded to kindness, that it could be temperamental, fickle, even spiteful, and in the bitter cold of a medieval night, it sometimes felt that way. If the fire popped loudly, it meant someone was talking about you. If it hissed, it was displeased. If the flame danced wildly, it was said to be warning you of something. These weren't just superstitions. They were ways of understanding the only force in the house that brought both light and danger. Chimneys were rare. Most homes simply had a hole in the roof to let out the smoke, or no hole at all. The air inside was thick, pungent, eye-watering, but you tolerated it. Smoke meant warmth, and warmth meant survival. You blinked through the haze and said thank you. Even in death, fire played a role. Ashes from the hearth were sometimes spread around the home for protection. Charred logs were saved and stored as good luck charms. The last ember of winter's final fire was not discarded lightly. It had made it through the worst. It was proof that someone had lived. Modern life makes it easy to forget how powerful fire is. We click a switch and heat pours from vents. We press a button and a flame appears on a stovetop. But back then, it was different. Every spark was hard-earned. Every glowing coal was a treasure, and every fire that survived the night was a quiet, crackling victory against the dark. So when you see images of peasants gathered by a fire, looking tired, wrapped in rags, eyes lost in the flames, understand what you're looking at. You're looking at people who knew that fire wasn't just useful, it was sacred. In the quiet war against winter, medieval peasants had a secret weapon. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't warm in the way wool or firewood might be. It certainly wasn't clean. But it was cheap, abundant, and surprisingly versatile. That weapon was straw. Straw was everywhere. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. After the harvest, once the grains were threshed and the useful parts were taken away, what remained was straw, hollow stalks. Dry, crackly, scratchy, and incredibly helpful. Straw was not just for the barn, it followed peasants inside. It filled their mattresses, covered their floors, padded their boots, and sometimes even insulated their walls. It didn't look like much, and it certainly didn't smell like much. Fresh straw had a pleasant scent for about a week. After that, it started to pick up the character of its surroundings, which, in a peasant home, meant smoke, mud, livestock, and the occasional rodent. But straw wasn't there to impress anyone. It was there to help you survive. Let's start with the floor. Many peasant homes had no real floor at all, just packed earth. When winter came, the cold rose up from the ground like a silent tide. To fight it, people layered straw across the floor, thick enough to walk on, sleep on, and sometimes lose small objects in. It acted as a buffer, not warm exactly, but warmer than bare dirt. It trapped pockets of air. It gave your body something to rest on that wasn't freezing. Sleeping on straw was more common than sleeping on wood or cloth. Some families had simple mattresses, sacks filled with straw that were flattened nightly by the weight of whoever collapsed onto them. Others just made little nests directly on the floor. It wasn't soft, it wasn't comfortable, but it was better than nothing, and sometimes that was enough. Every few weeks, the straw needed to be replaced. Not because it stopped working, but because it started growing things. Bugs, mold, smells. You could air it out, shake it out, but eventually you gave up and tossed it outside to be burned or used as animal bedding. Then you brought in a fresh pile and hoped it would last a little longer this time. Straw wasn't just under you, it was around you. Some families stuffed it into cracks in the walls, others packed it along the base of the house where the wind tried to slip in. In the absence of actual insulation, straw became the medieval equivalent of weatherproof foam. It didn't stop the cold entirely, but it slowed it down. There were even straw cloaks, made by tying bundles together into stiff, rustling wraps that resembled walking scarecrows. These weren't common, they weren't flattering, but if you had nothing else, they could shield your back from the wind long enough to chop wood or feed the animals. And then there were boots. Most peasants didn't own proper winter footwear. Instead, they lined their shoes with straw, stuffed it into the toes, tucked it around the sides. It helped. Not a lot, but enough. Enough to walk outside and not immediately lose feeling in your feet. Enough to get through one more chore before frostbite set in. Straw was also useful for fire. Dry and eager to burn, it was the perfect kindling. But that meant a careful balance. You wanted enough straw in the house to keep warm, but not so much that a spark could turn the whole place into a bonfire. Fires were an ever-present danger, especially in winter when everything was dry and everyone was desperate. A single ember could ruin an entire village. Still, straw stayed. People trusted it. They knew its limits. They understood its quirks. They accepted the itchiness, the constant sweeping, the occasional rat. Because straw, as humble as it was, had one important trait. It was available. You didn't need to trade for it. You didn't need to save up for it. You just gathered what the fields left behind and made do. Children played in it. Pets burrowed into it. Babies were laid in it. Couples whispered to each other from across it. And when someone got sick, they were tucked into it with a blanket, placed near the fire, and watched over until they either recovered or slipped away. Straw was part of life, part of every day, part of every night. It was silent, sturdy, always there. No one wrote songs about it. No one carved its image into stone. But if it could speak, it would have stories. Stories of cold feet, warm dreams, quiet nights, and stubborn survival. So next time you hear the word straw, don't think of golden fields or rustic decorations. Think of a family lying close together on a straw-stuffed mattress, listening to the wind scratch at the door and waiting for the morning light. Because sometimes, surviving winter came down to little more than dried stems and determination. At some point in the medieval winter, privacy stopped being a priority. Dignity gave up and went out the door. Comfort was no longer something you aimed for. What mattered was warmth. And warmth could come from some very unexpected places, including goats and pigs. And sometimes, a stubborn old cow named Marjorie. Yes, we are talking about livestock. Inside the house. Not in a separate barn. Not in a shed behind the house. But right there, in the same room where you slept, ate, and tried to patch your clothes. It sounds strange now, maybe even unthinkable. But back then, it made perfect sense. Animals gave off body heat, and heat was everything. It wasn't just about snuggling up with a warm pig, although that did happen more often than you might think. It was about shared survival. Animals were part of the household economy, yes, But in winter, they became part of the family in a very literal sense. They were brought inside, sheltered near the hearth, and sometimes even slept closer to the fire than the children did. A single cow could raise the temperature of a small room by a few degrees. A few chickens tucked into corners gave off little puffs of heat. Goats, with their constant fidgeting and muttering, added noise and warmth. Even sheep, if they behaved, were sometimes allowed in overnight. Of course, it wasn't all cozy bedtime stories and animal cuddles. Animals indoors meant smells, sounds, accidents. The floor was already straw-covered and dusty. Now, it was also occasionally muddy and not exactly sanitary. But no one complained, because the alternative was frostbite, sickness, or waking up to find the family goat frozen stiff in the shed. Bringing livestock indoors also protected them from thieves. In times of hardship, people got desperate. If your goat was in the shed, it might not be there in the morning. If it was sharing a wall with your sleeping children, it was safer. Less convenient, certainly, but safer. Some homes had a small partition, a low wall or wooden barrier to separate the animals from the humans. Others didn't bother. Space was limited. You took what you could get. If the pig wandered into your sleeping area, you nudged it back. If the chickens started pecking at your boots, you hissed at them and hoped they'd settle down. Everyone adapted. There were rules, informal ones. You didn't let the cow block the hearth. You didn't step on the cat. You didn't yell at the donkey unless it stepped on someone. But mostly, it was a quiet, uneasy truce. Humans and animals side by side, trying to make it through the longest nights of the year. Children sometimes named the animals, gave them nicknames, talked to them. They weren't pets, not really, but there was a kind of bond. When you shared your warmth, your food, and your breath with another creature, it became something more than livestock. It became a companion. In the mornings, the animals were led back outside. They huffed into the cold air, shook their ears, and trudged to wherever they needed to be. But at night, they returned. Like members of the family coming home. To modern ears, this all sounds messy, chaotic, maybe even a little sad. But it wasn't. It was practical, logical, a way to survive. And in a strange way, it created comfort. The low, rhythmic breathing of a cow, the gentle clucking of hens, the soft snort of a pig shifting in its sleep. These became the background sounds of winter, familiar, reassuring, proof that you were not alone in the dark. And when the wind howled outside and the fire flickered low, it was sometimes those extra heartbeats, those shared breaths, that made the difference. That kept one more ember burning, one more soul alive. So, next time you imagine a medieval winter night, don't picture solitude, picture a crowded room. Picture layered humans curled beside warm animals. Picture muddy hooves and sleepy eyes, and a shared warmth that didn't care about social rules. Because in a season where survival meant sharing everything, even a little bit of body heat could mean everything. The middle of the night, in a medieval peasant home, was not the quiet stillness we imagine today. It was not silent. It was not peaceful. It was a time of whispers, movement, and responsibility. Because in winter, sleep was not a luxury you could fall into and forget. Sleep had to be balanced with survival. Someone always had to stay awake, not all night, but in turns. The fire, you see, did not tend itself. Left alone, it would fade, and with it would go the only real source of heat in the entire house. That glow in the hearth was not just comforting, it was essential. And keeping it alive required effort, even when your body begged for rest. So, families created their own little system, unspoken, unwritten, but followed, nonetheless. The strongest stayed up first. Often the parents or older siblings. They sat near the fire, watching it, feeding it carefully, shifting the coals, poking the logs to coax another hour of warmth. If the fire flared too high, the fuel would run out too soon. If it dropped too low, it might die altogether. When one person began to nod off, another would take their place, quietly, sleepily, with stiff joints and heavy limbs. They would rise from their straw bed, step over sleeping bodies, and slide into the fire, watcher's seat. Sometimes the only light came from the glow of the coals. Sometimes, not even that. There was no clock, no hour hand moving gently through the dark. Time was counted by instinct, by the number of snores behind you, by the sound of the wind pressing against the walls, by how far the flame had travelled up the last log. Children were rarely assigned full shifts, but even they knew the importance of the fire. If one stirred in the night and saw the hearth flickering low, they might shuffle forward and toss in a stick or two, not because they were told to, because they understood. Everyone did. Fuel was always an issue. Good dry wood was rare. If you had any, you rationed it carefully. Sometimes, someone had to go out in the night to gather more. Not far, just beyond the door, to where a bundle of sticks might be kept under a cloth or behind a fence. Those moments were some of the hardest. Imagine it. You wake up to find the fire nearly gone. You wrap a shawl around your shoulders, slip into your clogs, and step outside. The cold hits you like a wall. The air is sharp, still, watching. You move quickly, not because you want to, but because your fingers are already going numb. You find the bundle. You gather what you can. You return, shut the door softly, and kneel before the hearth. You feed it your offering. You wait. You hope the flame returns. When it does, you sit back. You exhale. You listen to the crackle and pop. Maybe you smile. Just a little. In some households, the fire was treated almost like a member of the family, spoken to, thanked, encouraged. And if it died, there was a kind of mourning, a scramble to find help, a visit to the neighbour's house to beg for a burning coal. Sometimes the coal was given without question. Sometimes it came with a story, a warning, a reminder that next time you must stay awake. People passed the time in quiet ways, humming, praying, watching the shadows on the walls. Some whispered to each other. A soft conversation in the dark, just loud enough to keep each other from drifting off. These were not the loud tales of the day. These were soft words, barely formed. Questions about tomorrow, thoughts about spring, hopes. Outside, the wind howled. The roof groaned. The animals stirred in their corners, but inside, the house breathed. Shallow, slow, careful breaths. And when the next shift came, there was no announcement, just a tap on the shoulder, a nod, a trade of places. One person curled back into their straw. Another sat forward, pulling their cloak tighter, staring into the fire like it held all the secrets of warmth and survival. This was the rhythm of winter nights. Not stillness, not sleep, but shared duty. Quiet rotation. Everyone doing their part. Everyone giving what little they had to keep the cold from winning. And somehow, it worked. Night after night. Ember by ember. Breath by breath. When the wind got mean, and it often did, medieval peasants turned to one last defence. Not a thick door, not a wool-lined wall, just cloth. Soft, scratchy, sometimes damp, and almost always reused. They wrapped it around their heads, their necks, and especially their faces, in the hope that it would trap just enough warmth to make the difference between a miserable night and a survivable one. There were no scarves in the way we think of them today, no fleece-lined balaclavas, or fluffy hoods with faux fur trim. There was what you had, a corner of your cloak, a strip torn from a worn tunic, a rag that used to be part of a bed cover but had been repurposed so many times it no longer remembered what it was meant to be. At bedtime, you would pull it over your face, carefully, like tucking yourself into a hiding place. The goal wasn't comfort, it was to warm the air before you breathed it. Cold air stung the lungs, and too much of it made you cough. In winter, coughing was dangerous. Not just because of illness, but because once it started, it didn't always stop. And there were no doctors to make it better. Just old remedies, warm drinks, and prayers. So peasants did what they could. They created little breath tents, pockets of recycled air held close to the mouth and nose. The fabric would grow damp from condensation. Sometimes it froze. In the mornings, children would wake up with their cheeks stuck to the cloth. It wasn't pleasant, but it worked. Sort of. The fabric muffled sound too. It dulled the howling of the wind outside. It softened the sharpness of a restless animal or a creaking roof beam. Wrapped up like that, in layers of worn cloth, people felt less exposed, less watched by the dark. The world shrunk to the warmth of your own breath and the heaviness of your own thoughts. Not everyone used the same method. Some tied a length of wool around the bottom of their face like a bandit in a fairy tale. Others lay a folded cloth over their mouth while sleeping on their side. Mothers sometimes wrapped their children's heads so thoroughly that only their eyes peeked out, like little bundles of winter despair. These makeshift barriers were never perfect. They slipped off. They got tangled. They smelled of smoke and sweat and damp, but they were still better than waking with a throat so raw it felt like bark. Better than sucking in air so cold it made your teeth ache. You couldn't wear these wraps too tightly. If you did, you risked suffocating yourself slowly in your sleep. So you learned balance. Just enough coverage to keep the air warm, just enough room to breathe. It was a fragile system, held together by trial and error and shared memory. Elders passed on their own little techniques. Fold it twice. Tie it loose. Don't use this cloth. It makes your skin itch. Use this one instead. It holds the warmth longer. Children were taught early, not just how to wrap their cloaks, but why. The first time a child coughed hard enough to see stars, they understood. And still, every morning, there was discomfort. Wet fabric clinging to your face. Cold patches on your neck where the cloth had slipped. Itchy chins. Red cheeks. But also, the precious warmth that had stayed a few inches longer. The fire might have died down. The coals might have been weak, but your own breath had helped you through. There was a kind of intimacy to it. Everyone in the house, wrapped up like silent statues, layers of cloth, pale outlines of noses, the gentle rhythm of sleeping breaths under fabric. It looked eerie at times, like a room of ghosts waiting for dawn. But those ghosts got up. They stretched, they shook off the damp, they put the cloth aside, only to reach for it again that night. In a world without central heating, without hot drinks on demand, without the ability to make the cold go away, people learned to work with what they had. Even if what they had was just a square of fabric and the determination to see another sunrise. Because sometimes, survival was nothing more than a thin rag tied across your face and the hope that tomorrow would be just a little bit warmer. When winter pressed hardest against the walls, medieval peasants didn't fight it alone. They couldn't. One person could only hold so much heat. But a family, a huddled, layered, breathing group of people could create something bigger. A shared warmth, a shield against the cold, a small, fragile miracle that came from sleeping together. Beds were rare. Individual beds even more so. Most families slept side by side on piles of straw, sometimes on low wooden platforms, sometimes directly on the floor. Privacy disappeared during the winter. Modesty became a luxury that warmth simply didn't allow. The youngest were always closest to the fire. Babies and toddlers, swaddled in layers, tucked into corners beside the hearth where the heat lingered longest. Their tiny bodies couldn't regulate temperature as well, so keeping them warm was a priority. Grandparents, stiff and brittle from years of labor, often slept beside them. Not because they were weak, but because they had earned it. Age had its privileges. Everyone else arranged themselves in whatever space remained. Brothers next to sisters, cousins wedged between aunts and uncles, feet in faces, elbows in ribs. No one complained. It was just the way things were. Comfort took a back seat to survival. Sometimes animals joined the pile, not out of affection but necessity. A dog curled up at the foot of the straw bed added warmth. A cat nestled against someone's side offered a soft kind of heat. Chickens fluffed into corners like feathery heating stones. If a goat got too cold in its pen, it might be dragged inside and wrapped in cloth. There were no blankets as we know them, just cloaks, tunics, sacks of wool, whatever cloth could be layered and tucked. People wrapped their legs together, shared body heat under the same covering. The more tightly you slept, the warmer you stayed. Even if it meant waking up tangled and sore, the air in the room was still, thick with breath. If the fire was low, your breath smoked in the cold. If the fire was strong, the smoke curled under the thatched roof, filling the air with a haze that made your eyes water and your lungs burn. Either way, the room never felt clean. It felt used, lived in, necessary. Talking didn't stop just because the sun went down. Whispers passed through the dark. Someone might mutter about the fire. Someone else might mumble a prayer. Children whispered stories to each other. Parents gave quiet reminders. Don't kick, don't pull the blanket, don't breathe so loudly in my face. People adjusted all night long. Shifting, coughing, snoring. Someone always had a foot that needed tucking back under the blanket. Someone else always stole the warm spot. But no one got up, unless absolutely necessary. Leaving the pile meant leaving the warmth, and no one did that lightly. Sometimes, sickness crept in. One cough became 3. One fevered child became a night of worry. In a shared sleeping space, illness moved quickly. But so did care. Mothers pressed damp cloths to foreheads. Fathers added wood to the fire. Neighbors offered herbs, advice, stories. Because sleeping together wasn't just about keeping warm. It was about watching over each other. If someone shivered in their sleep, someone else wrapped an arm around them. If a child cried out, someone soothed them. If someone didn't wake up, someone noticed. This closeness created bonds that no amount of personal space could replace. It was messy, yes, cramped, certainly, but it was also connection. People knew each other's sleeping rhythms. Who talked in their sleep? Who kicked? Who always snored after eating cabbage? There was comfort in that. In the mornings, the pile broke apart slowly. One person stirred. Another sat up. A groan here, a stretch there. The room filled with the sounds of waking yawns, coughs, rustling fabric. Someone checked the fire. Someone else checked the sky through a crack in the wall. There was no such thing as waking up warm, but waking up surrounded by the people who had made it through another night with you, that was its own kind of warmth. A quiet, stubborn warmth that didn't come from fire or straw or cloaks. It came from each other. Not every winter night ended in peaceful sleep. Some ended in strange dreams, unsettling murmurs, and mornings where no one could quite explain what had happened in the dark. And oddly enough, it often started with turnips. Food in winter was more than survival fuel. It was strategy. What you ate before bed determined how warm you might stay through the night. A heavy meal meant a warmer body. Warmth meant rest. And rest was everything. But meals weren't exactly balanced. The winter diet for a medieval peasant was mostly whatever hadn't spoiled. Root vegetables, old bread, dried beans, gruel. If you were lucky, a bit of salted meat or a chunk of cheese. But mostly it was cabbage, turnips, onions, all boiled together until they became something soft and vaguely edible. The thinking was simple. A full stomach generated heat. Your body worked harder, your blood moved faster, and you didn't shiver quite so badly, so parents filled bowls high. Children ate even when they were already full. No one wanted to go to sleep cold and hungry. You didn't complain about the taste. You were lucky to eat at all. But there was a price. Because eating a bowl of boiled cabbage and turnips late at night didn't just keep you warm, it also did things to your dreams. People talked about it in hushed voices, the strange visions, the twitching limbs, the way some would cry out in their sleep, sweating beneath their cloaks, even when the house was ice cold. There was a word for it in some villages, a name for the dreams that weren't just dreams, but most people just called them what they were: bad nights. Maybe it was the food, maybe it was the cold, maybe it was both. A brain half-starved, half-frozen, now working overtime to process fears, memories, worries. The result? Visions of glowing animals, trees that whispered names, relatives long gone, appearing beside the fire, warning you about things you didn't understand. Some said it was just the hunger talking, others said it was something else. The cold had a way of playing tricks on the mind, especially when you were wrapped in cloth, pressed between two sleeping bodies, barely able to breathe, your nose stinging, your fingers numb. One night, someone might dream they were flying. The next night, they were drowning. Sometimes, the dreams felt more real than the room around you. You'd wake with your heart racing, unsure of where you were. And the worst part? No one could help. Not really. There were no cures for dreams, just quiet comfort and another bowl of soup in the morning. Children were most affected. They didn't have the layers of logic that adults used to explain away the fear. When a child saw eyes glowing in the dark corners of a dream, they believed they were real. When they dreamed of the fire speaking, they remembered every word. Parents would hold them close, whisper old prayers, tuck another cloth around their shoulders, and wait. Adults learned to live with it. They joked about it when they could, shared stories in the daylight, poking fun at their own strange nights. One man dreamed he'd married a chicken. Another claimed he wrestled with a spirit made of snow. These stories were passed around the village like warm coals, gently held, laughed over, and slowly forgotten. But deep down, everyone understood. Dreams were not always just dreams. In the dark, with the fire low and the cold pressing in, the mind reached for strange things. And sometimes, those things reached back. There were ways to avoid the worst of it, supposedly. Don't eat onions after sunset. Don't sleep with your feet pointing toward the door. Don't let your cloak cover your whole head, or you might trap the bad dreams with you. Did any of it work? No one knew. But when you're desperate, you try anything. And still, they kept eating the turnips, because warmth mattered more than comfort, because surviving the night was more important than sleeping peacefully, because in the grand balance of winter life, a few bad dreams were a small price to pay. In the morning, they would stretch, shake off the cold, and speak of their dreams only if they needed to. Most of the time, they simply got up, ate what was left, and moved on. There was wood to gather, animals to feed, straw to change. The dreams would fade, like mist in the daylight. But sometimes, a quiet look passed between two people by the fire. A nod, a glance, a silent agreement that yes, last night had been one of those nights. And they would sit a little closer to the hearth that evening, just in case. In the coldest months, when frost painted the windows and silence settled on the village like a second snowfall, something quiet and remarkable began to stir behind closed doors. Not in the churches or the manors, not with the lords or monks, but among the villagers themselves, among the old, the tired, the too young to work, and the no longer strong enough to plough. These people became watchers. Not watchers in the formal sense. There were no rosters, no patrols, no uniforms. Just a quiet sense of responsibility, passed along like a story no one remembered starting. When fields froze and animals stopped wandering, when most of the world turned inward to wait out the cold, a few stayed alert. They noticed which chimneys stopped smoking, which houses stayed dark, who hadn't come to the well in 2 days, whose door hadn't opened since the last snowfall. The watchers were not always the heroes of the village. Some were simply too frail to do anything else. Some were just curious. Some were kind without knowing it. But whatever their reason, they paid attention. They noticed things. If a home had no smoke at dawn, someone might wander over, slowly, pretending to check the fence, pausing near the door, listening. If the quiet inside felt wrong, they would knock. If no one answered, they might knock again, louder, then call for help. Sometimes it was just illness. Sometimes it was a fire that had gone out and no way to relight it. And sometimes it was worse. But no matter the reason, someone came. Someone always came. Fire, once lost, was hard to restore. If your hearth went cold in the middle of winter, it wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an emergency. You couldn't afford to waste precious kindling trying to spark something from nothing. So you went next door, or 2 doors down. You knocked, humbly, and asked for an ember. There was no shame in it. Everyone needed help at some point, and sharing fire, real, physical fire, was one of the oldest acts of community. You didn't just give someone warmth, you gave them another night of safety. The ember was carried carefully, often inside a small clay pot, or wrapped in ash to keep it alive. Children were sometimes sent on the errand, balancing the heat in trembling hands. A trail of smoke marked their path through the snow, and neighbors would open their doors before the knock even came. They knew what the visit meant. Inside the house, the new ember was laid gently into the hearth, blown on, fed, coaxed into life. Everyone leaned in close, watching the orange glow pulse like a heartbeat. When the flame finally caught, when the kindling crackled and the first wisp of smoke curled upward, there was no cheer, just quiet relief. Another night, one back from the cold. These exchanges were not recorded. No one wrote songs about the old woman who noticed the silent house, or the boy who ran barefoot across the frost to fetch coals. But they happened, again and again. In some villages, the watchers knew more than the priests. They knew who had food left, who had lost someone last year, who had just enough strength to share a blanket with their neighbor. They didn't speak much, but they saw everything. And when the cold loosened its grip in the spring and people began to venture out again, there were quiet nods exchanged in the muddy lanes. Not thanks, exactly. Something older than thanks. An understanding. I saw you, you saw me, we made it. Fire did more than warm the body. It tethered people to each other. It moved from house to house, hand to hand, heart to heart. A little glow in a dark world. A reminder that no one truly lived alone, even in the quietest corners of winter. So when you imagine the coldest nights of the medieval world, do not imagine only suffering. Imagine the watchers, the embers, the gentle knock on the door, the hand reaching out, not asking why, only offering what it had, and the flame that rose again, flickering into the dark, because someone had cared enough to notice. When warmth ran low and firewood dwindled, medieval peasants didn't just fight the cold with straw, layers, or shared breath. They also turned to something older, something quieter, a strange blend of faith, fear, and habit. In the space where survival met superstition, winter rituals began to take shape. These weren't official church ceremonies. They didn't come with robes or choirs or Latin chants. They came from grandmothers, whispered through generations, practiced in quiet corners with chalk and candles and soft, uncertain prayers. They came from people who didn't expect miracles, only mercy. One of the most common tools was chalk. After certain feast days, particularly around Epiphany or Candlemas, villagers would mark their doorways with chalk crosses or short blessings, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in a mix of local dialects. The markings were meant to keep the bad spirits out, or at least confuse them long enough that they left someone else alone. It wasn't always clear what the symbols meant. What mattered was that they were there. Candles were another staple. Not the thick, clean candles of noble homes. These were stubby, misshapen things made from animal fat and scraps of cloth. They burned unevenly. They hissed. They smelled. But they gave light. And if they were blessed, they gave protection too. Some families kept a single vigil candle burning through the worst winter nights, a tiny flame against the dark. If it sputtered and died before sunrise, it was taken as a warning. If it burned steadily until morning, someone might whisper thanks. People believed in drafts, not just the kind that slipped under doors and bit at your ankles, but drafts with intent, cold air that wasn't just cold, but watchful, malevolent. It had a mind. It wanted inside, and you had to make sure it stayed out. To block these drafts, people used bundles of herbs tucked into cracks in the walls. They believed certain smells could confuse the cold or scare it away. Lavender for calm, rosemary for strength, garlic for... Well, garlic was good for everything. No one questioned garlic. In some places, women often older, often half feared and half respected, were called upon to bless a room, not with ceremony, but with instinct. They knew which corner to sprinkle with ash, which wall to knock 3 times, which direction to face when speaking a charm. Were these witches? Not exactly, but they weren't just neighbours either. They lived at the edge of the village. They spoke with animals. They knew the names of plants that no one else dared to touch. And when winter pressed too hard, people came to them. Not openly, quietly, just in case. There were rules. Don't sweep after sunset. Don't whistle inside. Don't leave shoes upside down. Don't let your fire die on certain nights, especially the ones where the moon was new and the sky felt too quiet. If you followed these rules, the cold might stay outside. If you broke them, you didn't talk about what might happen. Children learned early, not from books, but from watching. A grandmother muttering as she tied a red thread around a bedpost. A mother tucking a small stone into a pocket. A brother refusing to walk a certain path after dark. These rituals were woven into the rhythm of daily life. They weren't questioned, they were repeated. Even churchgoers, even the devout, often kept a little bit of the old ways hidden beneath the new. A crucifix on the wall and a clove of garlic above the door. A prayer to the saints and a whispered wish to the wind not to be cruel tonight. Because when the cold settled deep and the fire burned low and nothing else seemed to help, people reached for what they knew. And what they knew was this: some things could not be explained, only honoured. So they drew the symbols, lit the candles, burned the herbs. They asked for blessings from saints and protection from spirits. They watched the shadows and read meaning in the way the fire danced. Did it work? Who knows? But it gave people something to hold on to, a sense of control in a world that offered very little. A way to fight the invisible, just as they fought the wind and the frost and the long nights. And sometimes, when the candle didn't go out, when the draft passed by, when the child with the cough woke up smiling, that was enough. It didn't matter if it was faith, luck, or something in between. What mattered was that they believed. And in the darkest nights of the year, belief could be warmer than fire. Winter shaped everyone, but it carved itself deepest into children. It settled into their memories like frost on a window, etched into the edges of childhood with a quiet permanence. Growing up in a medieval village meant learning to live with the cold before you even understood what warmth truly was. There was no gentle easing into the season. One morning you woke up and your breath made clouds in the air. That was the signal. Winter had arrived, and the long chill had begun. From that moment on, children adapted. Layers were added, not because they fit, but because they existed. Cloaks that dragged on the floor. Tunics patched so many times the original fabric had disappeared. Gloves made from mismatched scraps. Socks that had been passed down so many times, they were more whole than wool. But complaints were rare. You didn't say the tunic was itchy. You didn't say the boots were too tight. You were lucky to have them, and even luckier to still have all your toes. Play didn't stop completely in winter. Children still ran outside. They still climbed on fences, chased chickens, and dared each other to walk barefoot in the snow for 3 seconds. But there was always a line, a sense that fun was balanced with danger. A game of snow tossing could end with frostbitten fingers. A fall in the icy stream might mean a week of coughing and another lost blanket sacrificed for drying. Inside, children crowded around the fire like bees to a hive. They were assigned the warmest spots, not out of indulgence, but necessity. Their bodies lost heat faster, their fingers turned purple sooner, and their coughs lasted longer. Babies were wrapped so tightly in wool and rags that they could barely move. They slept beside the fire, near the old ones, watched carefully by mothers who checked their breath in the night with anxious hands. Toddlers learned early that pulling away their blankets brought a scolding. Not because the parents were angry, but because the cold didn't forgive. Meals became lessons. You ate everything, even if it was turnips, even if it was greyish soup made from dried peas, and something your mother wouldn't name. Food was heat. Refusing to eat wasn't picky. It was risky. So you learnt to chew fast and not ask questions. Older children helped more. They carried straw into the house. They fanned the fire when the adults were too tired to rise. They held the ember pot tightly during a nighttime coal run. And, when someone needed to be watched, a sibling too weak to sit up, an elder shivering beside the hearth, it was often a child who stayed close, keeping quiet company. There were few toys in winter. A carved piece of wood, a bundle of straw tied into a doll, maybe a string of bones from the soup, cleaned and dried into something resembling a rattle. But stories were plentiful. Told in the dark, whispered between blankets, passed down from older siblings who had heard them 100 times and still added new details each night. These stories often involved the cold, spirits in the wind, shadows that moved behind trees, the frost that crept inside if you left a door open too long. Children weren't shielded from fear. They were taught how to live with it. But they laughed too. They giggled under piles of fabric. They stole the warm spot and refused to move. They tickled each other with frozen fingers. They found joy in the tiniest crack of sunlight after 3 grey weeks. They celebrated when the stream thawed, even if just a little. They made memories out of misery. Some winters took children. The village remembered their names quietly, without speaking them too often. A cough that never stopped. A fever that rose too fast. A blanket that wasn't enough. But the others carried on. Carried the grief with them. Carried the rituals, the rules, the memories. Those who grew up cold grew up tough. But not hard. They learned empathy early. They knew what it meant to share warmth, to give up the better spot, to hand over the last bit of bread. Years later, when those same children had children of their own, they remembered everything. The way the fire felt on a raw face, the sound of a parent coughing in the night, the joy of waking up with all your fingers still moving. And they passed it all on, not through lectures, but through gestures, through cloth tucked tighter, through fire tended longer, through one more story whispered into the dark. Because childhood, for all its games and laughter, was also training. Training to survive, training to care, training to keep going, no matter how long the winter lasted. And somehow they did. In the deep of winter, long after the sun had vanished and the village had quieted into a breathless hush, sound became something more than noise. It became company. It became warning. It became comfort. For medieval peasants, the cold wasn't just something you felt. It was something you listened to. It started with the fire. Always the fire. The soft rustle of logs shifting as they burned. The gentle snap of a dry twig. The slow sigh of ash falling into ash. If you listened closely, you could tell how the fire was doing. If it hissed, the wood was wet. If it crackled, it was strong. If it stopped making sound altogether, someone needed to get up. The fire was the heartbeat of the house. And like any heartbeat, when it slowed or skipped, everyone noticed. Then there were the walls. The wind didn't just howl outside. It scratched, it probed. It found every crack and pushed through, moaning along the beams and rattling loose thatch from the roof. A strong gust could make the entire house creak, like an old man stretching bones that had been still too long. At night, those creaks and groans took on personalities. Children whispered that the roof was talking, that the wind knew their names. Some believed the spirits of the cold had fingers, and those fingers drummed against the shutters until someone inside moved. Inside, there were the quieter sounds. Breathing, the slow, uneven breath of someone sleeping near the hearth. The wheeze of an elder whose lungs never quite healed from last winter. The whisper of fabric shifting, of feet scraping straw, of someone turning in their sleep and pulling the covers tighter. Sometimes there were coughs, the dry, shallow kind that meant dust, the wet, rattling kind that meant something worse. Coughs were never ignored. One cough might be just a tickle. 3 in a row made everyone sit up. If someone coughed through the night, others stayed awake with them, just listening. You learned to recognize each family member by their night sounds. The baby with her soft, whimpering sighs, the father who snored like a distant drumbeat, the goat that muttered in its sleep, the floorboard near the fire that always creaked when someone stepped on it, no matter how lightly. Beyond the walls, there were other noises. The call of an owl, the bark of a dog far away, the sharp, strange cry of a fox, and if the village was lucky, nothing more. Because other sounds meant trouble. A scream in the night might mean a theft, or an animal killed by something hungry, or worse, a fire. Nothing moved faster through a village than the sound of flames and the shout of a neighbor calling for water. In winter, fire could be both savior and destroyer. And yet, for all the danger, the nights were not silent. When you lay still, with a cloth wrapped around your face and your fingers tucked under someone else's elbow, you didn't fall asleep to silence. You drifted off to the layered symphony of survival. Crackling wood, breathing bodies, the wind's whisper, the murmured words of someone praying into the dark. Sometimes people sang, not loudly, not joyfully, but low, almost inaudible songs. Lullabies passed down from mothers who learned them in the same cold house. Songs with no beginning, no end, just repetition, like a blanket of sound. These songs weren't meant to entertain. They were meant to fill the space where fear tried to creep in, to remind everyone, I am here, you are here, we are still alive. Children sang to siblings. Women sang to the hearth. Men hummed as they fed the fire one last stick before laying down. Sometimes, when the wind was kind and the fire strong, those sounds carried from one house to another. A neighbor's voice, drifting through the frost. Not words, just tone, just presence. And in the morning, when the village stirred and the sounds changed footsteps, chickens clucking, doors creaking, it was a different kind of music, a louder, messier kind. But in the darkest part of winter, before the light came, It was the quiet sounds that mattered most. The soft rustle of cloth, the hush of warm breath, the fire's soft reply. That was the sound of surviving one more night. There was always one night. Every winter had it. The night that pressed harder, held longer, bit deeper than all the others. The night when the fire barely held on, when no one truly slept, when every breath felt like it might be the last warm one for a while. The night everyone remembered. And then, somehow, morning came. It didn't burst in with golden light or cheerful birdsong. It crept in slowly, grey, hesitant, like it wasn't sure if it was welcome. But it came, a sliver of light through the smoke hole, a glow that turned shadows into shapes, a soft reminder that the world was still turning. The first to stir was often the person closest to the fire. They shifted, slowly, checked the coals, pressed a hand over the ash to feel for heat. If there was even a whisper of warmth, a flicker, a faint orange ember hiding beneath the grey, it was enough. The fire could be coaxed back to life. If the hearth was cold, there was a pause, a long one, a moment of silence that filled the whole house. Then, movement. Someone stood, wrapped themselves tightly, and made for the ember pot, or the neighbour's house, or the hidden bundle of twigs stored near the wall. The day couldn't begin until the fire did. The others stirred more slowly, stretching limbs that had been curled tightly for hours, rubbing eyes crusted with smoke and sleep, murmuring half dreams, feeling fingers and toes, checking for numbness that wouldn't go away. No one complained. Not loudly, not really. The coldest night had left its mark, and everyone could feel it, in aching joints, in scratchy throats, in the quiet that hung around, even as people began to speak. Clothes were pulled tighter, layers adjusted, scarves retied. Children burrowed deeper under blankets, not quite ready to face the world yet. But the fire was rising, and with it came the day. The first meal was always simple. Whatever was left, bread that had gone tough, porridge that clung to the pot, a bit of broth if someone had remembered to save it. But no one expected feasts. The food wasn't for pleasure. It was fuel, heat from the inside out. If the house had animals, they were checked next. A goat might be stiff from the cold. A chicken might not have made it. These moments were quiet. A hand laid gently on a still body. A sigh. Then the necessary work of removing what could no longer rise with the sun. Outside, the village looked different after the coldest night. Smoke rose slower, doors opened later, footsteps in the snow were fewer. It was a day for small things. Repairing the thatch that had sagged under frost, repacking the straw by the walls, whispering thanks to the neighbour who had shared a coal, sitting a little longer by the fire before beginning chores. People didn't talk about the night in great detail. They said things like, "That was a sharp one," or "The cold came in early," or "It felt like the sky forgot about us." But the meaning was clear. That night had tested them. Still, there was pride. Quiet, private pride. The fire was lit. The breath was warm. Everyone in the house was accounted for. Maybe someone had a cough. Maybe someone had a burn from feeding the fire too carelessly. But they were there, alive, together. Sometimes there were stories. Not right away, but later. A child would ask what the coldest night had been like 10 years ago. A grandmother would remember the year the fire went out and the roof caved in. A father would tell how he carried his sister through snow to find a neighbour's hearth. These stories were part of the fabric of winter. They stitched one generation to the next. The coldest night was a teacher. It showed where the house was weakest, where the warmth escaped, where the fire nearly died. It revealed which blankets needed mending, which door hinges needed fixing, which habits had become too careless. But it also revealed something else, that they had made it, that they had faced the worst and come through, even if just barely. And so, life resumed, slowly, tenderly, with fewer words and more glances, with hands warmed over the fire and feet that shuffled instead of walked. But it resumed, because after the coldest night, the sun still rose, and that, in itself, was enough. There's a strange kind of beauty in resilience, not the polished, gleaming kind you read about in poems, but the quiet version. The kind you find in cold places, under worn blankets, beside fires that don't always burn as bright as you wish. The kind you saw in medieval peasants, covered in dirt, wrapped in smoke, surviving not with pride in their appearance, but with dignity in their effort. To an outsider, a peasant home in the dead of winter might have looked like a kind of defeat: cracked walls, ragged clothes, children sleeping beside chickens, the air thick with the scent of damp straw and yesterday's cabbage. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't noble, it was survival, bare and unadorned. And yet, there was dignity. It showed in the way a mother brushed ash from her child's face before handing them a crust of bread, in the way an old man knelt by the fire to light it again, hands shaking but careful, in the way someone swept the floor even though it would be muddy again by nightfall. These weren't grand gestures, they were quiet ones. Acts of care, acts of defiance against the creeping cold and the chaos it brought. Hygiene was difficult. Water froze, soap was scarce, and bathing in winter was often dangerous. You didn't strip down unless you absolutely had to, but still, people tried. A cloth warmed by the fire, a basin of half-frozen water used to scrub faces, hair brushed out with fingers, clothes beaten clean with sticks on days when the ice melted just enough. And when it didn't, when everything stayed frozen and filthy and smoke-stained, people still found ways to carry themselves with purpose. They straightened their backs when walking to the well. They spoke with care. They shared what little they had with those who had even less. Dignity wasn't about being clean. It was about not forgetting who you were beneath the layers of soot and survival. It lived in rituals. The morning fire tended before anything else. The careful wrapping of the ember pot. The quiet prayers said over a bowl of soup. It lived in the songs sung to children. In the stories told again and again. Not because they changed, but because they reminded everyone that they were still part of something larger than the season trying to erase them. Even clothing told a story. Not one of fashion, but of function. The patched tunic meant someone had taken the time to mend. The extra strip of wool wrapped around a leg meant someone had noticed another's shivering. Clothes weren't pretty, but they were meaningful. They showed work, memory, care. And then there were the small things, the ones that mattered most. A wooden spoon passed hand to hand, worn smooth by years of meals. A corner of the house where someone carved marks in the wood to count the days until spring. A pair of gloves, handed to a neighbour because her fingers had turned too pale to ignore. These things didn't make it into history books, but they were the glue, the thread, the reason villages held together when everything else fell apart. Dignity didn't mean pretending the cold wasn't there. It meant facing it, doing what needed to be done, day after day, without giving in to bitterness. It meant laughing sometimes, even when your boots leaked. It meant sharing a joke with the person beside you, even when your fingers were too stiff to clap them on the back. And when someone died, because sometimes someone did, the village grieved with dignity too, not with great ceremonies, but with silence, with straw laid fresh in the spot where they had slept, with coals shared with the ones they left behind, with a name spoken softly, then carried forward in stories told by the fire. So no, medieval peasants didn't live clean lives. They lived honest ones, cold, muddy, imperfect, but laced with effort, filled with care, rooted in a dignity that couldn't be washed away by the frost or worn thin by the wind. And in that, there was something quietly noble, something worth remembering. Because even now, even far removed from straw beds and ember pots, there's something in us that recognizes the strength it takes to stand up, sweep the floor, and tend the fire simply because it must be done. Every winter took something. It never left empty-handed. A hen that froze before morning, a roof beam that cracked under snow, a neighbor who didn't answer their door. Loss didn't always arrive loudly. Often, it came in silence, like frost creeping across a window pane. The toll was quiet, and it was constant. In medieval villages, people understood that not everyone would see spring. It was not spoken as prophecy. It was accepted as truth. The old, the sick, the very young, they were always closest to the edge. But sometimes, it was someone in the middle. Someone strong. Someone who had chopped wood for others just the week before. There were no doctors, no hospitals, no medicine, as we understand it. When someone began to fade, all a family could do was bring them close to the fire, wrap them tighter, feed them what little warmth was left. Onion tea, herb broth, a soft prayer said beneath the breath, a hand held through the longest night. And still, it wasn't always enough. The village grieved together, but not with grand displays. There were no black garments, no solemn processions. Grief came in small gestures, a door left ajar to let the spirit pass, a name whispered when lighting the fire, a portion of food quietly set aside in memory. Work didn't stop. It couldn't. Even in mourning, the goats needed feeding, the straw needed changing, the woodpile needed tending. So the living moved forward, heads bowed, hands busy. There was no room for stillness in survival, but the sorrow travelled with them, tucked behind every task, stitched into every chore. Children asked questions in hushed voices. Why didn't grandfather get up? Why is mother crying behind the haystack? The answers were always gentle. He's resting now. She's remembering. No one explained too much, but children understood more than they were told. They learned early that winter meant more than cold feet and empty bellies. Sometimes, the grief came later. In spring, when the thaw revealed what had been hidden, a collapsed hut, a trail of footprints that stopped too soon. The cold had many faces, and it didn't always announce its presence. Neighbors watched each other more carefully in winter. Who missed the morning fire? Who had stopped coming to barter? Who no longer swept their doorstep? These signs mattered. A village was only as strong as its quietest members, and when one slipped away, the whole rhythm shifted. Even the animals sensed it. A dog that lay by a cold hearth for days. A cow that refused to eat. Grief settled over the village like snow, soft, weightless, inescapable. But life didn't vanish. It moved forward slowly. Yes, but forward still. Children were born, new straw was laid, embers were passed from hearth to hearth. And with each act of care, a little light returned. Stories helped, not just of the lost, but of the past. The winter 20 years ago when 4 families shared one fire. The year the snow fell so fast, the well disappeared. The night the baby was born in the hayloft, while the wind screamed outside. These memories were not just survival stories. They were reminders, proof that people had endured before, that they could endure again, that even in the darkest season, warmth could still be shared. So the quiet toll of winter, though steady and painful, was not the end of the story. It was part of it, a shadow across the flame, not the absence of fire. The people who stayed behind carried the memory of those who didn't. In every log placed on the fire, in every corner swept, in every child wrapped up tighter than usual, they didn't forget. They didn't let go. They carried on, with sorrow, yes, but also with a strange kind of strength. Because winter always came, and loss came with it. But so did morning, and the fire was still burning. Every night ended the same way, not with triumph, not with celebration, but with quiet, a long, low quiet that filled every corner of the room after the chores were done. After the animals had been fed, after the final scraps of bread had been divided, and the last child pulled their cloak over their face, that was when the embers began to speak. Not loudly, just a soft crackle, a hiss, a whisper rising from the hearth. The fire had done its part. It had warmed the soup, dried the wet sleeves, lit the room long enough for someone to stitch another patch onto a worn tunic. Now it lowered its voice and waited, smouldering, steady, a reminder that even in the deepest cold, something still glowed. People didn't stay up late. There were no lamps to burn, no books to read. Sleep came early because it had to. But before the last body settled into the straw, someone always checked the hearth. One last time, a practiced eye scanned the embers. A hand reached out, gently stirred the coals. Ash was banked over the top, sealing the warmth in for morning. This was not superstition. It was skill, and it was hope. Hope that when morning came, there would still be a spark to build on. That ember was more than fuel. It was continuity. The same fire that burned last night, last week, last month, passed on, preserved, kept alive not just by wood, but by attention, by care, by the silent promise that no matter how cold it got, they wouldn't let it die. And when everything else went still, the ember kept glowing. It glowed through the dark thoughts that came just before sleep, the fear that the roof might not hold, that the food might not last, that the neighbour who coughed yesterday might not wake up tomorrow. It glowed through the ache in someone's joints, through the numbness in their fingers, through the dread of another cold wind finding its way in. And somehow, it helped. Just a small red pulse in the centre of the room. But that was enough. Enough to believe that warmth hadn't entirely left the world, that it might return if you waited long enough, if you woke up early enough, if you reached for it before the chill had a chance to settle into your bones. The ember didn't demand attention. It didn't flare up. It didn't call out. It simply stayed, low, quiet, unseen, unless you knelt down close and looked. And that, perhaps, was the most human thing about it. Because people, too, endured quietly. They didn't shout their survival. They didn't ask for praise. They just kept going, through snow, through hunger, through grief. A little slower each day, maybe. A little more bent at the shoulders. But still going. And when someone stumbled, someone else helped. When one fire died, another was shared. When the cold pressed harder, people pressed closer. Not because they had answers, not because they had power, but because, like the ember, they refused to disappear. You could walk through a medieval village and not notice this. You'd see the mud, the straw, the smoke. You might even call it bleak. But if you stood still and waited for nightfall and listened closely, you'd hear it, that small sound in the hearth, that living ember, that fragile, stubborn light. It would tell you everything you needed to know. That in the darkest season, in the smallest homes, among the poorest people, something still burned. And even now, hundreds of years later, it still does.